Imagine waking up every single morning knowing that the gods are hungry, knowing that without blood, human blood, the sun will not rise tomorrow, that the crops will wither, the rains will stop, and the entire universe will collapse into darkness. Now imagine that you are the one chosen to feed them. Welcome to the world of the Aztecs. Few civilizations in human history have captured the imagination and the horror of the modern world quite like the Aztec Empire. And at the beating, blood-stained heart of that civilization stood two things that were utterly inseparable from each other: the warrior and the sacrifice. To understand one is to understand the other, and to understand both is to glimpse one of the most sophisticated, terrifying, and deeply human cultures that has ever existed on this earth. So let's go back, all the way back to the Valley of Mexico in the early 14th century. A wandering people called the Mexica, who would later become known to the world as the Aztecs, had been searching for a homeland for generations. According to their own sacred legends, they were guided by their god Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, the god of war and the sun, who promised them a sign. They would know their destined home when they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. And in 1325, on a marshy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, they saw exactly that. They called the place Tenochtitlan, and they built their empire from a swamp. Within 2 centuries, that empire would stretch across most of Mesoamerica, commanding millions of people, generating staggering wealth, and fielding one of the most feared armies the ancient world had ever seen. But this empire was not built on trade alone, nor on diplomacy, nor even just on conquest. It was built on a cosmic contract, a deal struck between humanity and the gods at the very beginning of time. And that contract demanded payment in the only currency the gods would accept: blood. To understand why, you have to understand how the Aztecs believed the world came to be. In the beginning, according to their cosmology, the gods themselves gathered in darkness and made an extraordinary sacrifice. They threw themselves into a great fire so that 2 of their own could become the sun and the moon. The universe was literally born from divine self-sacrifice. And this meant that humanity owed the gods an unpayable debt, a debt that could only be managed, never settled, through continuous offerings of blood and life. The Aztecs did not see human sacrifice as cruelty. They saw it as cosmic responsibility. They believed they were quite literally keeping the universe alive. This idea permeated every single aspect of Aztec life, but nowhere more completely than in the world of the warrior. Boys in Aztec society were consecrated to the god of war at the moment of birth. The midwife who delivered a male child would speak special words over him, telling him that his true home was not this earth, but the battlefield. His body belonged to the sun and the earth. Even his umbilical cord was treated as a sacred object. It was given to experienced warriors to be buried on a distant battlefield, so that from the very first hours of his life, a boy's physical essence was literally planted in the soil of war. Education for Aztec boys was divided along class lines, but the military component was universal. Noblemen's sons attended a school called the Calmacac, run by priests, where they received a rigorous education in writing, astronomy, law, theology, and the arts of war. Commoners attended a different institution called the Telpacali, the House of Youth, where the curriculum was more directly focused on physical training and martial discipline. But both schools understood that the highest calling a man could answer was to take captives in battle and to feed the gods. No Aztec male was exempt from this understanding. The physical training these boys underwent was extraordinary by any standard. From early childhood, they were conditioned to endure hardship. Fasting, sleep deprivation, cold exposure, and intense physical exertion were all part of the educational program. They ran, they wrestled, they practiced with weapons made of wood and obsidian. They learned to move in formation and to fight in the chaotic, close-quarters style that Aztec warfare demanded. By the time a young man reached his first campaign, usually in his mid-teens, he had already spent years preparing his body and mind for the moment of truth. And that moment of truth was everything. Because in Aztec society, a warrior was worth precisely what he had taken in battle. Not killed, taken. Capturing an enemy alive was infinitely more prestigious than killing him outright. A dead enemy on the battlefield was almost worthless to the Aztec warrior. A living, breathing captive, dragged back to Tenochtitlan in bonds. That was the currency of status, power, and spiritual achievement. That was how a young man proved himself to his gods, his city, and his family. A warrior who had captured his first enemy was celebrated and elevated. He received new clothing, new privileges, and a new social identity. But he was still considered an apprentice, under the guidance of the experienced fighter who had accompanied him. It was only when a warrior had taken multiple captives on his own, typically 3 or 4, that he was considered a fully proven fighter, a man whose courage and skill were beyond question. At that point, the most elite military orders in the Aztec world opened their doors to him. 2 of those orders stand above all others in the historical record, and they have captured the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for centuries. The first were the Jaguar warriors. The second were the Eagle warriors. These were not simply elite infantry units. They were sacred brotherhoods whose members were considered living embodiments of divine power, each order connected to specific cosmic forces that the Aztecs believed governed the universe. The Eagle warriors were associated with the sun, with daytime, with the sky, with the masculine, blazing force of Huitzilopochtli himself. They wore elaborate feathered helmets designed to resemble the head of an eagle, and their armor was covered in feathers that would have shimmered and caught the light as they moved. To face an Eagle warrior on the battlefield was, in the Aztec mind, to face a piece of the living sun. The Jaguar warriors drew their identity from a different, darker power. The Jaguar was the creature of the night, of the underworld, of the earth itself. Jaguar warriors wore the actual pelts of jaguars in battle, the spotted hide draped over their bodies, the head of the great cat forming their helmet, the empty eyes staring outward as they advanced. They were the darkness made flesh, the predator of the night given human form. To reach either of these orders, a warrior had to be exceptional. The numbers required varied across different sources and periods, but membership was never easy or automatic. These were men who had proven themselves repeatedly in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and they were given the finest weapons, the finest food, and access to the finest women in Aztec society. They drank in luxury while common people abstained. They were celebrated in art, in song, and in ceremony. And they were expected, in return, to perform feats of martial and spiritual valor that ordinary men could not imagine. Now let's talk about the weapons, because the Aztec arsenal was genuinely ingenious and genuinely terrifying in a way that modern people often underestimate. The most iconic Aztec weapon, the one that appears in nearly every artistic depiction of their warriors, is the macuahuitl, sometimes called the macana. This was a wooden club or sword, typically about 3 to 4 feet long, lined on both edges with blades of volcanic obsidian. And here is what makes the macuahuitl so extraordinary. Obsidian, when knapped correctly, produces an edge that is sharper than the finest surgical steel available today. Modern microscopy has confirmed that an obsidian blade can be reduced to a cutting edge just a few molecules thick. When the Spanish conquistadors first encountered Aztec warriors wielding macuahuitl in battle, they reported watching horses, fully armored war horses, decapitated in single strokes. Whether that is entirely accurate or partly exaggerated, we cannot be certain, but the weapon's capacity for catastrophic damage to unarmored flesh was absolutely real. The Aztecs also used a weapon called the atlotl, a spear-throwing device that had been used in Mesoamerica for thousands of years before the Aztec Empire arose. The atlotl was essentially a mechanical arm extension, a short rod with a groove and a hook at one end that dramatically amplified the speed and force with which a dart or spear could be launched. An experienced warrior with an atlotl could send a projectile with enough force to punch through the cotton armor, called ichkawapili, that was standard protective equipment for Aztec fighters. That cotton armor, incidentally, was soaked in brine and allowed to dry into a dense, layered garment that was actually remarkably effective against obsidian blades and could even slow down arrows and darts. The Spanish, who arrived in metal armor designed for European warfare, actually began adopting the Aztec cotton armor during the conquest because it proved better suited to the conditions of Mesoamerican combat. There were also bows and arrows, wooden clubs studded with obsidian, and a range of shields, from the simple wooden buckler to elaborately decorated ceremonial shields that were works of art as much as weapons. Aztec warriors going into battle were not drab or uniform. They were explosions of color, feathers dyed in brilliant reds, greens, and yellows, face paint applied in patterns specific to their rank and military order. The whole ensemble designed to be seen from a distance and to communicate, instantly and unmistakably, the message, I am dangerous, I am sacred, and I am here for you. But here is the part that many people find most psychologically fascinating about Aztec warfare. The goal, as we have established, was not to kill the enemy. It was to capture him. And this fundamentally shaped the way Aztec warfare was conducted at a tactical level that often put the Aztec military at a real disadvantage against enemies who fought to kill, like the Spanish. Because when your objective is to take a man alive, you cannot simply cut him down at the first opportunity. You have to subdue him, bind him, control him, which is significantly more difficult and dangerous than simply killing him, especially in the middle of a chaotic battle. This is why the Spanish, despite being dramatically outnumbered in many of their early encounters with Aztec forces, were able to inflict devastating casualties while suffering relatively few of their own. The Aztec warriors were trying to capture them, to bring them back alive for sacrifice, while the Spanish, equipped with steel weapons, firearms, horses, and dogs, and utterly uninterested in keeping their opponents alive, were simply trying to kill as many as possible as quickly as possible. It was a profound and fatal cultural misalignment, and it contributed enormously to the collapse of one of the greatest empires the Americas had ever seen. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we get to the conquest, we need to talk about what happened to those captives who were brought back to Tenochtitlan. We need to talk about the sacrifice itself. The great temple at the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid rising nearly 150 feet above the city, was the sacred center of the Aztec universe. It had two shrines at its summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, and one to Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture, life and death, war and sustenance, the sky and the earth, all meeting at a single point in the middle of a city built on water. It was here, at the summit of this pyramid, that the central ritual of Aztec religious life was performed. A captive, typically a warrior taken in battle, because the gods demanded the finest offering humanity could provide, would be led up the steep stairs of the pyramid by priests. The climb itself was part of the ritual. In some accounts, the captive was expected to climb willingly, even proudly, because to be chosen as an offering to the gods was considered an honor of the highest possible order. Not everyone in Aztec society believed this, and we should be careful not to over-romanticize it. But within the theological framework that Aztecs were raised in from birth, the sacrificial victim was not simply dying. He was transforming, becoming part of the divine. At the summit, for priests would hold the captive down over a rounded stone, a sacrificial stone, stretching his chest upward and backward to expose the ribcage. A fifth priest, using a flint or obsidian knife specially consecrated for the purpose, would make a single rapid incision below the left pectoral muscle and reach inside the chest cavity to extract the still-beating heart. The heart, Tlaloc in the ritual context, was then held up toward the sun, offered to Huitzilopochtli before being placed in a bowl called the Cuauhxicalli, the eagle vessel, where it continued to beat briefly in the open air. The body was then pushed or thrown down the steps of the pyramid, where it was received by priests and nobles below. The scale of sacrifice in the Aztec Empire is one of the most debated topics in all of Mesoamerican scholarship, and it is important to engage with that debate honestly. The numbers recorded by Spanish sources, who had obvious political and religious motivations to portray the Aztecs as monstrous, are often astronomical. The dedication of the rebuilt Templo Mayor in 1487, presided over by the ruler Ahuitzotl, is frequently cited as the event at which somewhere between 4,000 and 80,000 people were sacrificed over the course of 4 days. Even the lower end of that estimate is almost impossible to comprehend. Modern archaeologists and historians approach these figures with significant skepticism. Logistical analysis of the ceremony, examining how many priests could have performed sacrifices simultaneously, how many hours were available, how many people could have been processed in the physical space at the summit, suggests that even the most optimistic kill rate could not have produced numbers anywhere near the higher Spanish estimates. More conservative scholarly estimates for that single event suggest something in the range of a few thousand, which is still utterly staggering, but considerably more plausible from a purely logistical standpoint. What is not in question is that human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire was real, was systematic, was institutionalized, and occurred on a scale that had no parallel in the ancient world at that time. Excavations of the Templo Mayor site in Mexico City, which began in earnest in 1978 after a utility worker accidentally struck a massive carved disc while laying cables, have produced extraordinary evidence. Thousands of human bones, many showing clear evidence of ritual processing. Skulls arranged in deliberate patterns. The Tzimpantli, the skull rack, where the heads of sacrificed individuals were displayed publicly, has been confirmed through archaeological discovery to have been significantly larger than even Spanish accounts described. A section of the skull rack excavated in the 2010s and 2020s contained the skulls of over 600 individuals, many of them women and children, which complicated earlier assumptions that sacrifice was exclusively a fate reserved for captured warriors. The presence of women and children in the sacrifice record forces us to confront the most uncomfortable dimensions of Aztec religious practice. While captured warriors were the most prestigious offering, they were not the only one. Tlaloc, the rain god, was said to require the tears of children, the belief being that children's crying was sympathetically connected to rainfall. Young children, sometimes infants, were sacrificed to Tlaloc in ceremonies intended to bring rain and ensure agricultural fertility. These children were killed in ways designed to maximize their crying. They were sometimes carried through crowds who were supposed to remain joyful and celebratory. The contrast between the adults' enforced happiness and the children's distress considered a part of the ritual's power. It is a detail that resists any comfortable interpretation, and it should. Part of understanding the Aztecs honestly means sitting with the full weight of what their theological system required them to do, without either sensationalizing it into a horror story or rationalizing it away with cultural relativism until the human cost disappears. Real people suffered, real children died, and they died within a system that the people who operated it genuinely believed was necessary for the continuation of all life on Earth. That combination of sincere belief and devastating consequence is one of the most challenging things human history asks us to reckon with. The connection between the sacrificial system and Aztec warfare goes even deeper than the simple equation of captive equals offering. There was an entire category of warfare that existed for the primary and explicit purpose of taking sacrificial victims. Conflict that was not about territory, resources, or political power, but was purely and specifically about acquiring the human material the gods demanded. This was called Zakiayotl, the Flowery War. The Flowery War was a remarkable and deeply strange institution by the standards of any other military culture in history. It functioned essentially as a formalized agreement between the Aztec Empire and neighboring states, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who would later become crucial Spanish allies, to meet periodically on agreed battlefields and fight prearranged battles whose sole purpose was the taking of captives on both sides. The fighting was real and could be brutal. Men died. But the strategic objective was not victory in any conventional sense. It was acquisition. From the Aztec perspective, the Flowery War served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided a steady supply of sacrificial victims when actual conquest was not producing enough captives. It kept the warrior class sharp and battle-ready between major campaigns. And it maintained a state of controlled tension with neighboring powers that kept those powers from becoming either too strong or too weak. A kind of geopolitical balance of terror maintained through ritualized violence. But the Flowery War also had a darker, more cynical dimension that some scholars have argued was fundamental to its purpose. By fighting the same enemies repeatedly without actually defeating or subjugating them, the Aztec state ensured that a permanent source of enemies, and therefore a permanent source of sacrificial captives, would always be available. Total victory would have meant the end of the supply chain. The gods could not be allowed to go hungry, so the enemies could not be allowed to be destroyed. It is one of the most perverse applications of strategic thinking in military history, deliberately preserving your enemies so that you can continue to bleed them. What did all of this do to the warriors themselves? What was it like to live inside this system, to be simultaneously a soldier, a priest, a cosmic servant, and a potential sacrifice. Because here is something that often gets overlooked. The Aztec warrior did not believe he was exempt from the system. He understood, at a deep and visceral level, that his own body might one day be carried up those temple steps. Warriors captured in battle could be sacrificed by their captors, and this was accepted as a legitimate and even glorious fate. There are documented cases of Aztec warriors captured and facing sacrifice at the hands of enemies, who maintained their composure and even their pride throughout the ritual, because within their worldview, dying in sacrifice was a warrior's proper destiny, perhaps the most honorable end available to them. Warriors who died in battle or in sacrifice were believed to ascend to a specific and extraordinarily privileged afterlife. They became companions of the sun, traveling with Huitzilopochtli through the sky each day, spending their eternal existence in the company of the god of war himself. For 4 years after death, these warrior souls accompanied the sun on its daily journey. After those 4 years, they were believed to transform into hummingbirds, which is why the hummingbird was a sacred animal in Aztec culture, and they would spend eternity flying through fields of flowers, drinking nectar, existing in a state of effortless beauty and freedom. The contrast between the violence of their death and the delicacy of their promised afterlife is one of the most quietly extraordinary things about Aztec cosmology. Ordinary people who died of other causes faced a much more ambiguous and difficult afterlife journey. A long, perilous trip through the underworld called Mictlan that could take years and required the correct burial goods, the correct rituals, and the help of a spirit dog guide. The afterlife of the warrior's sacrifice was genuinely elite, genuinely coveted, and it reinforced at the deepest psychological level the culture's equation of violent death with transcendence. This theology also explains something that puzzled the Spanish conquistadors enormously: the willingness of Aztec warriors to fight with what appeared to be suicidal courage. Men who charge into battle without apparent concern for their own survival are terrifying opponents under any circumstances. But when you understand that those men genuinely believe that dying in battle or in sacrifice was the best possible outcome of their lives, that it guaranteed them a divine afterlife of unimaginable beauty and honor, then their courage takes on a different quality entirely. It was not recklessness. It was not despair. It was a rational response to a theological system that made violent death the most desirable thing that could happen to a fighting man. The psychological effects of growing up in this system, knowing from birth that you might be called upon to die for the gods, knowing that your social worth was measured in captured bodies, knowing that the universe itself depended on a continuous supply of blood, must have been profound and complex in ways that are genuinely difficult for modern people to access. Aztec art, poetry, and philosophy are saturated with a particular kind of melancholy, a beauty tinged with impermanence, a love of flowers and music and feathers that seems almost unbearably poignant when you consider the context in which it flourished. Aztec poetry, some of which survives in documents compiled after the conquest by indigenous scholars working with Spanish priests, returns again and again to the brevity of life and the glory of dying well. One famous poem, attributed to the poet King Nezahualcóyotl of the neighboring state of Texcoco, asks whether anything on earth is truly permanent, and concludes that only flowers and songs, art and beauty, endure. This was written by a man who lived within a culture of systematic sacrifice, who would have watched human hearts lifted toward the sun and understood it as a sacred and necessary act. The coexistence of that violence with that beauty is not a contradiction. It is the essential paradox of the Aztec world. The role of women in this system is often overlooked, but is genuinely significant. Women were not warriors in the conventional Aztec sense, but they were not simply passive observers of a male martial culture either. Aztec theological thinking drew an explicit parallel between a warrior capturing an enemy in battle and a woman surviving the ordeal of childbirth. Both were considered acts of valor that brought life force into the world. Women who died in childbirth were given the same elevated afterlife as warriors who died in battle. They too accompanied the sun, but in the opposite direction, traveling with it during the afternoon and into the west, as warriors accompanied it in the morning from east to zenith. This parallel elevated women in the cosmological imagination even as it subjected them to very real social constraints. Midwives who presided over particularly difficult births were treated with a respect adjacent to the respect given to successful warriors. A woman who had died in labor was considered so supernaturally powerful that her left forearm, if it could be obtained, was believed to give warriors the paralytic power to freeze enemies in battle, which led to the disturbing practice of young warriors attempting to steal the forearms of recently deceased women from their families. A grim detail that illustrates just how thoroughly the sacrificial and martial logic of Aztec culture permeated every dimension of life, including death. The Spanish conquest, which began in earnest with Hernán Cortés's landing in 1519 and culminated in the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, brought the Aztec warrior tradition to an end with a speed and totality that remains astonishing even 5 centuries later. In the span of roughly 2 years, an empire that had taken 2 centuries to build was overthrown. And the reasons are complex. Spanish military technology played a role, but so did disease, which killed indigenous people in staggering numbers, and so did politics, since many of the peoples subjugated by the Aztec Empire saw the Spanish as potential liberators and allied with them eagerly. But the sacrificial system itself may have contributed to the empire's fall in a way that has not always been fully appreciated. The flowery war and the broader culture of taking captives rather than killing enemies in battle left the Aztec military strategically exposed against opponents who did not share this objective. When Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies fought with the explicit goal of killing as many Aztec warriors as possible as efficiently as possible, the Aztec tactical response, shaped by generations of warfare oriented toward capture, was sometimes catastrophically inappropriate. The muscle memory of an entire military culture worked against it in its hour of maximum need. After the conquest, the Spanish moved with extraordinary speed to dismantle the institutions of Aztec religious and martial life. The temples were torn down or built over. The Templo Mayor was demolished, and a Christian cathedral, which stands to this day, was constructed on and from its ruins. The military orders were abolished. The sacrifice was prohibited on pain of death. An entire cosmological system, with its warrior priests and its Eagle and Jaguar brotherhoods and its cosmic contract in blood, was officially erased within a generation. But you cannot truly erase something that was embedded in the bone and muscle and imagination of millions of people. Elements of Aztec culture survived, transformed, hybridized, in language, in food, in art, in the way people organized their communities and understood their relationship to the natural world. The Nahuatl language spoken by the Aztecs is still spoken today by well over 1 million people in Mexico and Central America. The eagle and serpent that guided the Mexica to their promised island appear on the Mexican flag. Huitzilopochtli's symbol, adapted and transformed, watches over a modern nation of more than 100 million people. The Aztec warrior is gone. The sacrifice has ended. But the civilization that produced both of them left traces in the world that time has not been able to fully erase, any more than time has been able to erase the questions their existence raises. Because when we look honestly at the Aztec world, at its extraordinary art, its sophisticated astronomy, its complex legal and agricultural systems, its poetry, its music, its philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence, and we hold all of that alongside the sacrificial altars and the skull racks and the children carried weeping toward the rain god, we are forced to confront something genuinely challenging about the nature of human civilization itself. The capacity for breathtaking beauty and systematic brutality is not an Aztec anomaly. It is a human constant. Every civilization that has ever existed has found ways to make its violence sacred, to give its cruelty theological or ideological cover, to persuade its people that the suffering of others is necessary for the survival of all. The Aztecs were extraordinary in the scale and the explicitness of that bargain. They put it on top of a pyramid for everyone to see. They made it the central, organizing fact of their universe. They did not hide it or dress it in comfortable abstractions. They looked directly at what their gods demanded, and they paid the price with their eyes open. Whether that directness makes them more honest than other civilizations, or simply more terrifying, may be the most interesting question their legacy leaves us with. The sun rose every morning over Tenochtitlan, and the Aztecs believed, with total sincerity, that it rose because of what they did. The universe held together because they paid the price. And when we sit with that belief, when we really try to inhabit it, to feel the weight of a cosmology that placed the continuation of all existence on the shoulders of warriors and priests and the people who climbed those temple steps, we understand something that no horror and no admiration and no easy judgment can fully contain. We understand what it means to believe that everything depends on you. And we understand what human beings are capable of when they believe it completely.